Happy birthday, Mr. Productivity Podcast. Today is the 7th anniversary, the 7th birthday of the Mr. Productivity Podcast. And if you would have told me back in 2017, before I launched this podcast, that I would hit 7 years, I would have called you crazy. Not only have I hit 7 years, but this is episode number 1287. That is absolutely crazy. I cannot believe I've been podcasting as long as I have. And before I tell you what I'm going to do on this very special episode of the podcast, is I want to tell you a little background of how this podcast got started. So in the spring of 2017, I happened to catch Gary Vaynerchuk, an entrepreneur I am very impressed with because he shares so much great information. He's not the only one, but he's one of the ones I do follow, read all of his books, watch him on all the social media platforms. He has helped my career so much. I happened to catch one of his videos in the spring of 2017 where he said, the future is voice and audio, and everybody needs to have a podcast. Now, I used to be an on-air radio DJ back in the day, back in the 80s and early 90s. And I remember thinking to myself, when I watched this video, could I have a podcast? I listen to podcasts, but could I, Mark STRUCZEWSKI, also known as Mr. Productivity, have my own podcast? I went to Google and typed those fateful words. How do you start a podcast? Maybe I said, how do I start a podcast? Because saying, how do you start a podcast would be weird. But anyways, I digress. And I got answers. And I started my podcast. And the very first platform I used was GarageBand because I'm a Mac user. But now I use something called Hindenburg and for my solo podcasts. And then I recently went to Squadcast, which is owned by Descript. None of those, by the way, are sponsors of the show. My first 17 episodes were solo episodes, just me, because as I learned about the wonderful world of podcasting, people told me, keep it as simple as possible. As simple as possible. In other words, avoid complexity. Guests enter complexity because you don't know them as well as you know yourself. So the first 17 episodes, I did just me. Then I started doing interviews. Then I started going back and forth. Sometimes I would do a solo episode. Sometimes I would do a guest episode. In late December 2020, I had this crazy, absolute insane idea to be Gary V when it comes to podcasting and release a new episode every single day. And I started on Christmas Day 2020, and I made it until the second week of October 2021. That was a very big challenge. I told my wife in October 2021, I can't do this anymore because here's the thing. I would have 4 or 5 guest episodes lined up for a week of recording, but if a guest canceled, I had to immediately drop what I was doing and create an episode. It caused a lot of stress. So I don't do episodes every day. Actually, I've gotten into a cadence now of releasing a new episode every Monday. This is an exception. Now, you may not be listening to this on Sunday, July 7th, but this is the 7th anniversary of the podcast. So if I would have released it on a normal day, Monday, it would be July 8th. It wouldn't be as interesting. Now, you're probably not listening to this on July 7th, but the point is it was released on July 7th, 2014. One note, I used to call the podcast the Mark STRUCZEWSKI Podcast because it's my name. And then I had a coach who suggested that I rebrand it to the Mr. Productivity Podcast, which I did in December 2022. I also have MrProductivity.com. I have trademarked Mr. Productivity, and that's the backstory of how the podcast got renamed. So that brings me to this episode I'm going to share with you today. I have, like I said, this is episode 1287. There is not any episode I regret doing. whether solo or guests. And I've had close to 900 guests on the show. I love every single one of my guests, but one guest really is my favorite. Now, I know you're not supposed to have favorite guests because the other guests are going to go, oh, why wasn't it me? The guy's name is John Beatty. You probably never heard of him. He's not a Mark Cuban. He's not a Tony Robbins. He's not a Gary Vaynerchuk. But this guy summited Mount Everest, and he almost didn't make it. And I have always been geeked out about Mount Everest. That's the tallest point on our planet. This guy summited it, but he almost didn't. And his story is fascinating. So for the 7th anniversary, the 7th birthday of the Mr. Productivity podcast, I have decided to re-air that episode. Now, I didn't just take that MP3 file and throw it on here and that's the episode. I actually went through, to be honest, my wife actually went through and re-edited it because that episode came out when it was the Mark STRUCZEWSKI podcast. I wanted to take all that stuff out, but the bulk of the conversations there, I even asked the question. This is the question I asked that you're probably going to wonder, wow, he asked that question? That's pretty interesting. Here it is. I asked the question, how do you go to the bathroom on Mount Everest? Because there's no rest areas. There's no bathrooms or hotels. How do you go to the bathroom on Mount Everest? Men and women. So if you're weird like me and you want to know the answer to the question, you are going to find it out in the episode here with John Beatty. Again, I don't have a favorite episode. I love all my guests, but this one, because I geeked out about Mount Everest my entire life, I was so thrilled to have someone who actually summited the tallest peak on our planet on the show. This was episode number 67. Boy, one number off. I think it wasn't episode 666. Wow, that would be crazy. But episode 667, this aired on November 18th, 2020. Here is the entire episode with John Beatty again. Enjoy. He has climbed to the top of the tallest mountain on every continent, including Mount Everest. He's a worldwide adventurer who has traveled to 65 countries, written 3 books, and given keynote presentations to nearly 1 million live audience members. His new book is called The Warrior Challenge, 8 Quests for Boys to Grow Up with Kindness, Courage, and Grit. John Beatty, welcome to the podcast.
Mark, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
One of the reasons, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm selfish here. One of the reasons why I want you on the show is I am fascinated by people who have summited Mount Everest. And one of my goals in life, believe it or not, is happening right now. I'm actually talking to someone who actually stood at the very top of Mount Everest. This is something that not a lot of people can claim. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, is there anything other than what I just told the people about you that you wanted to add to fill in the gaps for us?
Oh, just that you're allowed to be selfish if you want. Let's take some time for self-care. If that means you got to talk to an Everest climber, let's do it.
I love it. I love the attitude. So the reason why I'm so fascinated by climbing on Mount Everest, there's 2 reasons. Number one, I always tell people that everyone needs to have what Jim Collins from Built to Last called a big, hairy, audacious goal, BHAG. And I always use the reference of climbing Mount Everest. What is your Mount Everest? Even though you may never reach it, what is your big goal? And second of all, I think people are fascinated who actually know, and this is what I want you to talk about a little bit today, is what does it take to climb Mount Everest? Obviously, you didn't decide on a Thursday you're going to climb Mount Everest and you got your buddies together and you did it on that weekend. It's a big, long process, both physically, mentally, and financially. Am I correct?
Oh, absolutely. Usually when you say to people like I climbed Everest, they don't quite grasp the massiveness of the mountain. I remember I was telling somebody I was about to go back right before I climbed, and they were like, oh, Mount Everest, I love California. It's a 2-month-long climb, and you're every day exhausted. It takes 10 days just to walk into base camp. Your body's acclimatizing. It's trying to produce more red blood cells, which is incredibly taxing on your system as it is, just to be able to survive at these altitudes. You get up to 17,500 feet, and then you don't shoot straight for the summit in one push. You build your camps doing ladders up and down the mountain. So you go from base camp up to camp 1, back down to base camp. Then up to camp 2, back down to base camp. Each time you get to base camp, you spend 3, 5, 7 days, resting, recovering, waiting for weather, healing, training, then up to Camp 3, back down, up to Camp 4, push for the summit, all the way back down, all while you're dealing with people complaining, whining, moaning about how hard it is. People on the season I was there, 9 passed away every season. Some number of people pass away. It's a given on the mountain. And you're in between -10 and -40 degree temperatures with the wind whipping around you, making it like up to -90 degrees with the wind chill factor. Avalanches are collapsing around you. The ice is cracking underneath you. And probably the next question is going to be like, what would make somebody so crazy to do that?
Yeah, actually, that's on my mind because when you said 10 days to walk to base camp, give me and my listeners an idea. Where is base camp? How far is that? If it was a level mountain, let's say, that sounds silly, but let's say I live in Houston, Texas. There are no mountains or hills in Houston. So how far is base camp in terms of straight mileage?
Okay, so Nepal is the side that I climb from. The summit of Mount Everest makes the border between Tibet and China and Nepal. So for reference, where that is, if you look at India, that pointy thing that sticks into the Indian Ocean, it's directly north of India. And the way that the climb works is you land in Kathmandu, Nepal, then you take this tiny little airplane to a village called Lukla. And the airport is built into the side of a hill, and it's not a full straight line. It looks like a hook or like a fishing hook, but a landing strip. And so when the pilot lands, he's actually facing uphill because it's not flat. So he has to come down low, aim the plane up, land on the uphill runway, and then come to a hockey stop at the end of the hook in order to stop the airplane. There's no space, but that's the best they could find.
Yeah, I just saw a YouTube video about the 15 most dangerous airports in the world.
That's in there.
Yeah, it is. And I'm like, you don't take like a 747 in there. These are like little planes because the runway's like really short. But again, back to my original question, 'cause I'm really fascinated on this. If I were to walk the distance from the beginning to base camp in terms of mileage, because I run every day, so I'm curious to know how long, if I just walk that mileage straight, how many miles is it?
The exact number, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to guess It's around 60 to 80 miles.
Really? Wow, I had no idea. Wow.
We're going to Google this right now.
Yes, this is live, folks. This is the way I do my shows. I don't do any
let me
prep or
Google
anything
that
like that.
for you. It's 100 kilometers long, round trip, 65 kilometers each way. Now,
That's just the base camp.
That's just to base camp, and that doesn't compute because of the altitude. Like in the States, if you go for a 65-kilometer trek, that's going to be, or in Canada or wherever the listeners are right now, if you go on a trek like that, you're like, oh, cool, I can knock out like 20 in a day on a hard day. But you're not taking into account that you get up to 14,000 feet on like day 3 or 4, and that's the highest point in the contiguous U.S. You're up there in totally thin air. The oxygen is about a third. It's a 50% at 14,000 feet, and at 29,000 feet on the summit, it's a third of the oxygen that you and I are breathing right now. So it makes the trekking incredibly slow going. There are donkeys and yaks that are going past you. Sherpa are incredible. You've got trekking Sherpa who carry 300 pounds, up to 300 pounds on their backs, and they're walking around in flip-flops, and they make this trek. It's insane. And we're there like with 30 or 40 pounds on our backs with like full hiking boots, trekking poles, and just huffing and puffing and dying. And you see this guy that's 5'2" trek past you in flip-flops and just leave you in the dust. It's incredible.
Wow. I've watched several documentaries about climbing Mount Everest. And one of the things I saw recently, which really irritates me, and I'd like to know your thoughts on this, these people who go up to Mount Everest, they have the Sherpas carrying everything. And I think if you have someone carrying up all your baggage, your luggage, whatever word you want to use it, and all you have to do is climb, I don't think that counts as much as someone who carries their own stuff. I saw one show where a lot of rich people, apparently this is a thing with rich people, the Sherpas would bring tents and stoves and food. And it's, are you kidding me? So they showed them sitting at their tables and they're having their, dinners and the Sherpas are around them. What is this? It's just gotten so crazy because back in the day, they didn't bring restaurants with them up the hike.
Yeah, that's a great point. I definitely think that the Sherpa are the heroes of Everest. And on the expedition that I went on, I had a Sherpa with me the entire way. He was my guide. He was my hero. He was my leader on the trip. And we work as a team. And so was I setting up my own tent? Did I carry the bulk majority of my equipment on a day-to-day basis? Absolutely. Did I also accept help when it was offered? I did. And I don't think that there are many climbers who will say that I'll climb Mount Everest unsupported. And those who did, who were there, actually ended up not summiting because they got in a fight, because this is their mountain. This is the Sherpa's mountain, and it's also their livelihood. So in a large way, I believe and felt that it was respectful to accept help when it was offered.
You obviously made the summit, but I know I've heard stories of people, I've read books where people have gotten so close. They can see the summit, but maybe there's a storm coming or whatever the case may be. That has got to be so painful to be so close and realize maybe you're having physical issues, health issues, whatever the case may be. You have to turn around and go back. That has got to be so heartbreaking. Do you know anybody who's come so close and had to turn around and go back?
I know many people who were on my expedition team who got turned around and had to go back, but I can tell you from firsthand experience, I was turned around. My first oxygen bottle was completely empty on the trek or on the summit night on the climb up, and I went for about 2 hours without oxygen.
Oh, wow.
And that put my lungs into a state of total distress. There's conditions, it's called pulmonary edema, which is your lungs are swelling, and cerebral edema, which is when your brain starts swelling. Both can be totally lethal conditions. We finally found a second oxygen bottle, and I start climbing up further and further towards the top. I get to the Hillary Step, which is the last major feature before you can see the summit. And Nuru, who is my guide, who's with me, knocks on the oxygen canister twice, and it makes this heart-wrenching, hollow, pinging noise. And he says, "There's no more air in this one. We got to go back." I'm like, "You're kidding. I can see the summit. I'm looking at it right now. Like that, can't we just run up and put a pinky toe on it and then go back down? Come on, man." He's no, you're going to die. You have barely any oxygen left, and we can't figure out how to seal this up. So I had trusted him the entire climb and trust him now. Start walking back down the mountain, leaving this 17-year-old dream behind me. After maybe 5 minutes of walking back, I get back to the top of the Hillary Step, and out of nowhere appears a guide named Justin Merle out of Seattle, Washington. And he's, "Congratulations, you made it." I'm like, I'm turning around. I have to go back. He says, "Oh, let me check out what's going on with your oxygen." And he looks at it and he takes the regulator and he dips it into his tea. I'm like, what is this guy doing? He unscrews his tea bottle and there's steam coming out of it. It's minus 30 degrees. And he's dipping his, I'm like, come on, dude. We're going to kill me up here. I need that. Give it back. And he pulls it out, screws the regulator back into the oxygen bottle. And he says, "Okay, you're good to go." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He says, "What does water do when it freezes? It expands." And we watch there in real time as the negative 30-degree temperatures freezes that water and expands it. And it seals the leak that was causing me to lose that oxygen. He says, "Wow. Go up, get to the summit, take your pictures. You're still on borrowed time, but I've bought you some more, and then get back down." And so I know very well what it's like to turn your back on it. And I had that blessing of Justin showing up and giving me that second chance. Wow. Does it suck? Does it suck? Yeah. And I've talked to people who didn't make it and didn't have that second chance, and I think it haunts them.
So how far away from the summit, like you said you could see it in terms of, we can't go distances because you're so up high. In terms of time, if you see the summit, like the point where you're going to turn around, you had to turn around because your oxygen levels, how far of a walk is that? Give me and my listeners some perspective on that.
I would have guessed distance-wise, it was about 300 to 500 yards, somewhere in that distance. But time-wise, that probably would have taken me 30 to 45 minutes because it's really so slow at that altitude.
Now, I've heard stories of some people, not many, have gone to the top without oxygen. Do these people have some kind of specialized training? Do Sherpas have oxygen? Tell us about that.
Great question. I think it's still just under 100 people who have ever summited Everest without oxygen, because the human body just can't function that far away from sea level. You just don't work. However, Sherpa are born above, usually 14,000 feet above sea level. And so their bodies are just acclimatized over generations of genetics to be superior humans at that altitude. They just have the advantage, period. Do they still use oxygen? Many do when they're guiding, but most don't when they climb on their own. Westerners or anybody who's not born with a heritage or genetic lineage above that altitude, there are very few people who have gone. Like Ed Viesturs is the guy who, first American who climbed all 14 8,000 meter peaks in the world. And they did some diagnoses of his lungs, and he had 1/3 extra lung capacity than the average human. And that's what gave him that advantage. And it's not the only factor, obviously. Skills and dedication and hard work goes into it, of course. But he still had that extra oomph, which I don't have. My lungs suck at altitude.
Now, before I ask you any more questions, I have to go back because you wanted to talk about the why. And I think everyone listening to this conversation is going to want to know, okay, I get you're a climber, John. We get that. But Mount Everest, this is a huge undertaking. This is not something you do on a weekend with your buddies. So what is your why for climbing Mount Everest?
It shifted as I climbed bigger and bigger mountains with always having Everest in mind. At first, it started out from a place of displaying I was from ego. It was, I want to look like a total badass and climb this mountain and prove my mountain man worth. 100, like, fully honest with you, I was in my 20s when I started that.
I appreciate that.
And it was like, I just want to look like a total, like, stud to everybody in the world.
Honestly, that's awesome.
The mountains I climbed, though, the less I started caring about what others thought. I'd get up some climbs and people that I thought were awesome and nobody cared. I wouldn't even succeed on some climbs and some people would say, oh, that's amazing. And I saw that there was this disconnect, and I also started just valuing myself more. And then it became proving something to myself. It was, do I have what it takes to dig deep, to see what's within me, and to conquer my inner demons and the voices that we all have in our minds of, you can't do this, you're not good enough to make the summit, you don't have what it takes, or your body hurts so bad. I wanted to learn how to overcome those because they show up in so many more places in life than just the mountains. After I got that under my belt and where I am now, my real why and my motivation for climbing still to this day is to remind myself that I can be at peace amidst the chaos that's happening all around me. Wow. When there's a storm, when there's the inability to breathe, when you've got other people who are complaining, and I'm able to sit at peace and know fully well that I just am, like I am the mountain. That's what my why is now.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. So as you're trekking up the mountain, is there any point or points, plural, that you said to yourself, what am I doing? I'm just going to go and turn around. I can't do it. Did you go through that, or was that not an issue?
Oh, every single day. Every minute, actually. The most pronounced moment that I remember having that sensation was doing what we call the first rotation from base camp up to camp 1. So you wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning because you want to go through the first feature, which is called the Khumbu Icefall. It's a 2,000 foot tall frozen waterfall with massive blocks of ice. It's a glacier that's just cascading down this hill. And so it's like basically a frozen whitewater rapid that's 2,000 feet tall. And I wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning because you want to climb when it's coldest out so that that structure has the best chance of staying in place and not collapsing. And as so we climb throughout the night with headlamps, wanting to get to wherever you're going before the sun rises, the sun hits the ice. And that's when it's, okay, everything's unstable for the rest of the day. Wherever you got to is where you got to. So I'm waking up and I feel the floor underneath me shaking and cracking at base camp, because base camp isn't on dirt. It's still on that glacier. So all throughout the night, you can feel these fissures and splitting and pings and groans and pangs of this ice cracking underneath your body. And so I just woken up. I'm in the sleeping bag. All this is going on around me. An avalanche. I hear in the distance, you hear them throughout the night, but I hear this roar of an avalanche and then the floor cracking underneath me. And I flick my headlamp on and I have this real confront yourself moment of, do I really want to do this right now? And I chose that, yeah, it's still worth the risk for me.
So when is the best time of year to summit Mount Everest? I can't remember what the documentary said, that there are certain times you can go and there's certain times you can't go. There's not like a great time to go where it's 75 degrees and gorgeous. It's going to be cold no matter where you go. But when is theoretically the best time to go if you wanted to summit Mount Everest?
Yeah, there's no time where you're like in a meadow singing with like Sound of Music thing. So Everest sits in the jet stream. Same thing the airplanes fly up and get into. And the reason one side of it is blank, you don't see snow on it, is because there's 180 miles an hour of winds blasting the side of a mountain for the vast majority of the year. When the Asian monsoon starts to the southeast of Everest, it pushes that jet stream north, usually, sometimes south, and that buys you a little weather window of still-ish air where it's only 20 to 30 miles an hour usually to get up to the top. And that's about 2 weeks long, sometimes 10 days, sometimes 7, sometimes 20 days. But that's why in this last season, you saw this picture of a big line of climbers all going on the same day, because they'd been waiting for this monsoon to stop. So that's not like it happens, or not they were waiting for the jet stream to be pushed off. So that picture isn't representative of what's going on every single day. That was just a function of all these antsy climbers wanting to get their summit bid in. So you have an opportunity that's in the spring, to get specifically to the question. Mid-May is when that happens. The other smaller opportunity, which is much more difficult, is in the fall. And I think that's late September, early October, when that window opens. But it's a smaller window, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all.
So do people not try to climb the mountain outside these two windows?
Correct.
Wow.
Nobody even attempts it. It's like, it would be stupid to go up into 200 miles an hour wind.
That's insane. Okay, I got to ask you a real question, because I'm a guy, and I got to ask this question. So how do you go to the bathroom when you're summiting Mount Everest? Because obviously you don't have nice, comfortable showers and heated bathrooms and stuff like that. This is who I am, John. I know there's listeners going, yeah, that's a great question. How do you go to the bathroom when you're summiting Mount Everest and it's like 1 billion degrees below zero? Not really, but...
Okay, you went there, so I'll go there too. We have a joke that we would say amongst ourselves that the hardest part of climbing Mount Everest is trying to find it underneath 3 inches of down, and it's that cold outside.
Oh my goodness.
You go in a bottle. You put the bottle inside your down suit, fill up the bottle, and then dump the bottle outside of the down suit. So you keep all your bits protected.
Wow. Yeah, we don't want to go there. And how about women climbers? Because women climbers don't have, let's say it, a penis. It's a family show. We're not saying anything vulgar. How do women do it? It's like most women, they go to the bathroom and they pull their pants down, but you can't do that on Mount Everest. You'll freeze to death.
There's a awesome invention that has allowed women mountaineers to have almost the same level of ease of that function in mountaineering. It's a funnel. There's a funnel that's shaped, and they come in different sizes and shapes, that you just find the one that fits your body and creates a penis for you.
You really got to want to. This is crazy. Just thinking about that. Okay, so another question I have for you is, I heard that there's someone created, and correct me if I'm wrong, this may have been not true. People are coming up with helicopters that can fly pretty high up Mount Everest. If that is true, they can't go to the summit, can they?
I believe that the highest, I might be wrong here, but I think a helicopter within the last 2 or 3 years from this recording went and either got close to the summit or was able to just like ding one of its landing rods, whatever they're called, onto the summit.
That's cheating. Someone paid you, that's cheating.
So that's like a pilot a helicopter pilot without doors on the helicopter, no seats back there, every bit of weight possible completely removed. So
climbers can't pay $1 million and be up to that amount?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So for rescue efforts, the highest there's been a rescue is Camp 3, which is at 23,500 feet. But even those are incredibly dangerous for not only the pilot, but everybody else who's climbing on the mountain. With the air that thin, a gust comes and throws that helicopter off of its trajectory and slams it into the side of the mountain. Most pilots wouldn't even consider that. So the highest that you could get taken to would be base camp. But even if you went
Wow.
there, you're not acclimatized. So it's actually counterproductive to feel like you're cheating your way up versus walking, because those 10 days are really critical in helping your bloodstream develop the red blood cells, which are what carry the oxygen to your brain and your heart.
I saw a show a couple years ago on the Travel Channel about the rescue people on Mount Everest. And they had these helicopters and stuff like that. And to watch these episodes, I wish the show would keep going on, but I guess how many episodes you're going to do? It's all on Mount Everest. It's just insane because it's not like here in Houston where it's 70 degrees outside right now and your oxygen works just right and you can have your hands and stuff like that. When you're doing a rescue up on really cold areas of the mountain, it's totally different. So you got to have a good pilot. You got to have the medical guy who's got to be properly trained for all this stuff. And they were talking about people having heart pains, chest pains, and stuff like that. Heart pain, chest pain. Maybe they were heart pains because they were heart breaking. They can't make they can't make the summit. But it's a real thing. And there are people who have died on Mount Everest, and they just left the bodies there because they're frozen. And now, a morbid question: did you see any of those on your trek up?
Yeah, and it's not because they're frozen. It's because at that altitude, it would take a team of 12 to 20 people in a body recovery effort that would put all of those people at risk. And so are there like mounds of bodies, like in some gruesome, like Holocaust style grave? No, of course not. But the bodies are pulled off to the side and buried in the ice. And there are grave sites on the way up, and they're all at the highest, most exposed places. There are bodies that are moved from the main trail, but you can see them. I did experience up close and personal the deaths of 2 climbers on summit night. And that was a harrowing thing to deal with in the moment. And it was a harrowing thing to process afterwards. And I can go into detail of those if you like. But for me, it was the part of Everest that I grew the most from as a human being after the climb.
Yeah, go into that really briefly for us. I don't want to totally gross out our listeners, but go briefly about when you saw this happening.
Sure. So on summit night, when I left camp, there was a guy who was being brought back down to camp with a team trying to rescue him. And when I got back to Camp 4, he was passed away in his tent, and nobody had noticed, I don't think, the moment that he actually passed away, because the tent fly, or the door, was open on the tent. And so when I came back to mine, it was facing his, and there was this passed away guy just sitting upright and looking at me, or not looking at me. So that was the first one I saw, the first person I saw. The second was more harrowing in that I was about at 28,000 feet above sea level, so around 2 or 3 in the morning, and his team had left him thinking that he was dead. He was frozen into the ice, and I saw these reflectors that I thought was like a backpack that was left, like light reflectors, because my headlamp is filling in. And when I got closer, I'm just in the zone. I've got my head down, and I'm just trying to watch my breathing and control my energy levels. And when I got closer to him, he started moving, and everyone who was in front of me said no, he was gone. But for whatever reason, he started moving when I was there. And I did everything I could for as long as I could before I started feeling myself freezing to try and rescue him or revive him. And Nuru kept saying, "Come, nothing to do, come, nothing to do, come, nothing to do." And what I think now in hindsight was going on was it was just a spasm of the last bits of energy. So he was not conscious. That created post-traumatic stress disorder that I recognized in December, or when I finally admitted that something was up with my mindset. And I spent a good amount of time in therapy working through this trauma. And I would like to tell anybody out there, if you're going through something tough right now, or if you've gone through something traumatic as a firefighter or a doctor or a military service member, or you've seen a car accident or even a bad breakup or relationship splitting up that has truly rocked you to your core, it can be the impetus for post-traumatic growth. I think we focus too much on the post-traumatic stress, and we think that it's like this permanent condition that will never change or you'll never be the same again, which is a bunch of BS. You can get stronger and you can come out looking at your life with a healthier mindset if you go to the right people who know how to set the bone straight, so to speak.
Very true. Thank you for pointing it out. So when you got to the summit of Mount Everest, Two questions. Number one, how long were you able to stay there? And number two, what did you do at the top of the world?
So the oxygen's running out, and I snap a photo as soon as I get there. It timestamps. I'm like trying to warm the camera up because after the first photo, the battery shuts the camera off because it's so cold, right? It just sucks the energy. I'm like, great, one photo of the horizon, and that's all I'm going to get up here? Come on. So I put it in my breast pocket. I'm trying to warm it up. I start looking around and like in disbelief that there's no more mountain to climb. It was like this panic of like, wait, I got to be taking more steps. I've been taking steps up for 2 months. Where are the other steps to go up? Like I didn't register that was it. I'm looking out at the sun coming up over Tibetan China, this huge, massive plateau. On the other side, Mount Everest's shadow is being cast for dozens of miles into the distance, and I recognize peaks that are 20,000, 25,000 foot mountains. And I'm looking down on those, and their shadows are being cast out over the horizon as well. So it's this magical moment. I start crying at the beauty of both accomplishing this dream and the physical beauty of it all. Then the tears start freezing on my face. And I'm like trying to wipe these like chunks of ice off of my eyes because my eyelids are being frozen shut. And I'm like, okay, picture. Pull out the camera. And I get Nuru and myself in a few, I think we got 4 extra photos before the camera shut off again of us on the summit. And the last timestamp was 11 minutes from the first one. And that's when we started walking down. And that's the entirety of the time that I spent on the summit.
When you left the summit, when you started going back down, what is that called? Not something. What's on the way down? What do you call it?
The descent. The descent.
From the time you started descending to the time you got all the way back, way past base camp, all the way back to ground. It's still up in the mountains, but how long did that take you? Because did it take you longer to go up than down?
Absolutely. Yep. It takes longer to go up than down, but down in my mind is just as important, even though time frame wise, it's shorter. That's where most injuries and deaths occur in mountaineering is on the way down. You're tricked into thinking that the work is done. Your steps get lazy and you're exhausted. And so you let your guard down. And in mountains, if one thing goes wrong, like if a finger gets cold and you don't get that finger warm, that cascades into a heap of other problems. So suddenly you can't unzip your backpack because your fingers are too cold. And then you don't have food because you couldn't get into your backpack. And then you don't have energy and so on until you pass away. Right. So time wise, I summited at 5:51 a.m. and I got back to Camp 2 at 8 p.m. If you rewind there,
you just skipped like the Camp 5, 4, and 3. You just went right down to 2.
There's no Camp 5. I get to Camp 4, spent about 30 minutes there, realized that my lungs were filling up with fluids. There's pulmonary edema starting. I radioed down to base camp. I said, guys, I'm coming down now. And they're like, yeah, absolutely. Start moving. Skipped Camp 3 completely and got to Camp 2 as fast as I could, because the only thing that truly works for altitude conditions is getting down. There's no medicine that actually heals. It only buys you time.
The final question I have for you before we talk about your book is, when did you get warm again? I can imagine you being up in the frigid temperature for months. At what point did you say, oh my gosh, I am completely thawed out now?
I'm still waiting for that moment, Mark.
I can't imagine you. Hot showers, you probably never enjoyed a hot shower more than when that first hot shower after you came back.
That's an accurate statement. When you're in, minus 90 degree, what was crazy is I live in Las Vegas. And so I had minus 91 degree with the wind chill weather on Everest. And 10 days later, I arrived back in Las Vegas where it was something like 110 degrees.
My goodness.
And so I had a 200 degree temperature shift.
That is crazy.
That was completely overwhelming to my system. Like my brain couldn't comprehend what was happening in that heat.
Wow. Yeah, because I know sometimes, this is how a wuss I am. Sometimes I go to a store and it's really cold and I come out and sit in my car with the windows all rolled up and I just thaw out. And that's probably like 68 degrees in the store. You are like minus 90. So you're a better man than I am, John.
You're like, why do they have to keep this lettuce so cold?
Let's talk about your book. Tell us the title of the book again and what prompted you to read it. So tell us about your book.
This book is called The Warrior Challenge: 8 Quests for Boys to Grow Up with Kindness, Courage, and Grit. And this book is partially about my mountaineering stories, but it's more examples of heroes and role models throughout history who exemplify virtues and values specifically for young men ages 10 to 16 years old. And so it's like throughout this book, the reader is confronted by a Maasai warrior to hunt a lion. And that teaches stepping up, like being a better human being. Then you're Danny Way jumping over the Great Wall of China, and you learn self-awareness, how to observe what's going on in yourself, what's going on in your relation to other people. Then you're barreling down the Baja Peninsula in an off-road vehicle, learning how to choose what your values are in life. Then I come in and I teach what happened on Everest with this guy who passed away and talk about vulnerability and the importance of being emotionally honest. It covers boundaries. It covers grit and resilience. It covers how to avoid toxic relationships and not be a toxic human being to others. And it covers equality and how to find your purpose in life. All of these principles coupled up with the most insane, awesome stories of adventurers that I've ever heard in all my travels.
And where can we get the book?
If you go to Amazon, look for the bright red cover, just type in The Warrior Challenge, and please leave a review for me. That would definitely help it as well. If you want to follow what's going on with the book beyond the purchase, then head to warriorchallengebook.com. And there I have some bonus resources and really, if you want to make a difference in the world, start with the young man who's in your life, whether it's your nephew, your grandson, your son, a student of yours. Gift this book to him. I truly believe that it will make a massive difference in the trajectory of his life and that he will avoid a lot of the struggles that you and I have had to figure out as we've grown into the men that we are today. I figure it's so much easier to make a young man into a healthy man than it is to go fix a guy who's still a man boy. And this book is what sets young men up right to become healthy, functioning men who look after their societies and know how to look after themselves.
Wow. Sounds like a really interesting book. You graciously sent me a copy. I haven't read it yet, but I will. It's on my
Get on that, Mark. Get on that, Mark.
I'm a slow reader, John. I'm a slow reader because I really like to take the time to enjoy.
Fortunately for you, there's an audiobook too.
Doug,
I'm not taking excuses.
Doug, one final question. Where can we go to see these pictures that you took on the top of Mount Everest?
Oh, that's a great question as well. Head to johnbeede.com, JOHNBEDE.com, and I'm releasing documentaries of each of the 7 summits.
Oh, wow.
The tallest mountain on every continent. I've done one that's up to Everest Base Camp at this point. I've done Vinson, which is the tallest in Antarctica, and Denali in Alaska. And the Everest one is coming along. You could also go to my Instagram to search for John Beede, follow me there, and you'll be able to see some of the pictures from Everest.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really geeked out on this interview. I normally don't geek out with interviews because I've done so many of them, but I am so amazed. I'm talking to someone who is actually at the top of the world, and it wasn't an easy trek for you. And I appreciate you being completely vulnerable with us for that, because if you don't know a lot about Mount Everest, I don't know as much as you, but I've watched enough documentaries. I've read enough books to know it's not a walk in the park. It's a lot of effort. A lot of people die on there. And I am so thankful you came on the show and shared your insights with us. So thank you so much.
Mark, thank you for having me. Thanks for the awesome questions and for your interest. And it was a joy to be with you and everybody listening.
There you have it. My favorite episode, I keep saying favorite. I don't have a favorite guest, but it is my favorite episode because of the story that John just shared with us. I hope you really appreciated his story, and I hope you gleaned a lot of lessons and figured out maybe how you could apply it in your life, because I thought his story was absolutely phenomenal. So I want to thank you, whether this is your first episode, whether you've been with me a few years, whether you've been with me all the way from the beginning, July 7th, 2017, 7 years ago today. I thank you so much for your support. And I would like to hear from you. If you would do me a ginormous favor, there's a number of ways you can get a hold of me. You can go to MrProductivity.com and click the contact tab. You can find me as Mr. Productivity on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube, although you can't DM me on YouTube. On X, I'm known as Mark STRUCZEWSKI. Good luck with that. And on LinkedIn, I'm known as Mark STRUCZEWSKI, also on Snapchat. So I'd love to hear from you. Did you like the episode? Do you like the show? Do you have any suggestions? Where do you want me to take the episodes going in the future? Because I'm not giving up this podcasting game. I love the podcasting platform. So please reach out to me. Again, MrProductivity.com. Click on the contact tab, or the easiest thing is to DM me on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok or X. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for listening to the episode today. I really appreciate it. Won't be back tomorrow if you're listening to this on July 7th, which you're probably not. I'll be back a week from tomorrow, back on our regular Monday schedule and with a brand new episode. Thank you so much again. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.